Want to welcome to the show Chancellor Professor of Law and Political Science at UC Irvine, author of Election Meltdown, Dirty Tricks, Distrust, and the Threat to American Democracy. Rick Hasen, welcome to the program.
Great to be with you.
Rick, I got to say that if I went on one of those like Predictits or one of those betting sites where you could invest in someone, I would want to invest in your entire academic discipline because it sort of feels like we're at peak moments, at least right now, and maybe sadly for the coming years in terms of election law with Amy Coney Barrett joining the court.
Well, I think when I'm really busy talking to the press, that usually means the country's in trouble. So I take it as a sign of unhealthiness.
Yes. Let's first start with the most recent ruling that has everybody abuzz about Kavanaugh's, I guess it's dictum, right? That in his assessment of the Wisconsin case, where a federal court extended the deadline for the counting of ballots that were returned or postmarked by Election Day, the ruling wasn't necessarily a surprise. I'd like you to tell us why that was. But what was sort of set off some alarm bells was Kavanaugh's, I guess, what he wrote in regards to that ruling.
First of all, I should say it's less than dictum. Dictum would be when a court issues a decision and then it kind of makes a statement on the side. And this was a concurrence. So he was speaking only for himself. He wasn't speaking for the court. So it's less than dictum. It's Kavanaugh for himself. So okay. I think that's useful to say. He was not writing a majority opinion for the court. And
that's important because that just means that nobody else has signed off necessarily on what he's talking about.
Right.
Okay.
So we know what the vote was, but we don't know which other justices agreed with his reasoning, given that no other justice signed on. He signed on actually to a separate opinion that Justice Gorsuch wrote, which has gotten less attention. Just to put it kind of in perspective, I think there are two issues with what Justice Kavanaugh did, but let me back up and explain what the court did overall. We've seen a series of cases where, because of the pandemic, voting rights lawyers and Democrats have gone to federal court and they've said, the rules that are in place, especially for mail-in voting, are they're not a big burden on voters in normal times, but during a pandemic, it's a big deal. For example, in South Carolina, you have to get a witness signature to turn an absentee ballot. Ordinarily, not a problem. In a pandemic, could be a big burden. And so federal courts have come in, some of them, and they've changed the rules. They've made it easier to vote during a pandemic. And these voting rights groups and Democrats had a lot of success getting district courts to issue these kinds of rulings. But over the last few months, the appeals courts and the U.S. Supreme Court have been turning back these rulings, saying mostly federal courts don't have a business rewriting election laws. Even in a pandemic, it's up to the state to decide how to balance health and safety on the one hand against voting rights on the other. And so there's been a 5-3 majority in a bunch of these cases, and that includes Chief Justice Roberts as well as the other conservatives on the court. This was just another one of those cases. I didn't think Wisconsin was going to be a big deal at all because Wisconsin fits that mold. The reason it's a big deal is because Kavanaugh did two things. Number one, he indicated that in cases coming up from state court, where a state court applying a state constitution loosens the rules during a pandemic, that might violate the Constitution because that would mean that the state court would be taking away the power of the state legislature to set the rules for conducting federal elections. That's a much more radical theory. That's a theory that garnered 3 votes back in Bush versus Gore 20 years ago. And it's a theory that could especially play out in Pennsylvania and North Carolina. Those are 2 states where you have Democratic-dominated Supreme Courts, Republican-dominated legislatures, and the state Supreme Courts coming in potentially and easing the rules during a pandemic. So we've got both North Carolina and Pennsylvania cases now pending again before the Supreme Court. This is an issue on which the court divided 4-4 in a Pennsylvania case about extending the deadlines last week. And they've now gone back up with Justice Barrett now on the court to see if they can get a better result. So the Republicans are trying again. The other thing that Kavanaugh did was he made some really loose, fast and loose statements. He was very sloppy in his opinion, which is not what I would normally expect from Justice Kavanaugh, but he was very sloppy in describing a lot of the facts and describing the holdings of some cases. But most troublingly, he suggested that it's bad for democracy if all the votes are not counted by election night and the results, he said, flip. To which Justice Kagan replied in her separate dissent for the three liberals on the court, when we're counting the votes on election night, they're never final, they're never certified, there's no flipping, we're just continuing to add votes until we figure out who the assumed winner is, something that's not officially done until weeks after the election. And so it was this kind of Trumpian signal that Kavanaugh was sending that I think most set off alarm bells among a lot of people.
All right, so let's start with, well, I have a question before we get to the two aspects of Kavanaugh. And forgive me, I made it through 1 year of law school. And so you will see that my knowledge abruptly drops off a cliff at one point of these things. But the Wisconsin Board of Elections or whatever their system of voting is says you can apply for a ballot as late as tomorrow night, I think it was the 29th, by mail. And there's just simply no way the mail, with the way that it's operating now, is going to get you the ballot and you're going to be able to mail it in by then. Isn't there some type of obligation if the election board says, do it this way, you can vote this way, that they have to count your ballot? I mean, isn't the idea that we are 6 days out from an election, does that not in any way implicate the decision of any of the courts?
Well, I think it was Justice Scalia who said the Constitution does not bar stupidity. And so, it's a pretty dumb system. The question is whether it's a voting rights violation. And it's really up to state officials to decide. And for months, we've been urging state officials to change that deadline and not allow people to request a ballot more than, say, 2 weeks before Election Day, because the Wall Street Journal just did a study finding that it's taking at least 6 days for ballots to get back. And so I think you're right that if anybody requests a ballot today or tomorrow, the chances that they're going to be able to successfully vote by mail are very slim. It's possible if they get it out. And they're fighting in Detroit, same thing. The ACLU had to go in and sue because Detroit had promised they would get people ballots out within 24 hours of a request, and they weren't even doing that. And so there are still people waiting for their ballots. My advice to anyone who does not have an absentee ballot in hand right now is to plan to vote in person. And my advice to anyone who does have an absentee ballot in hand, if you're allowed to, and you can return it to a state office or a drop box, you should do that. Otherwise, you should vote in person and surrender your ballot if the state makes you do that. That's probably the most important thing I'm going to say in this entire discussion that we're going to have.
And that's the practical implications. But this also, I think, this dynamic, the fact that Scalia can say, like, the Constitution doesn't bar stupidity. I mean, if and correct me if I'm wrong, but if I said to you, like, I'm making you an offer of selling, whatever it is, my car, and you can reply by mail, and you do actually reply by mail, but I don't get it in the mail or whatever, it comes late, right? I'm still obligated to honor that offer I made to you if you accepted it because of mail. I mean, so, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think I got that in first year, but it suggests that the rights that we have under a contract are actually greater than we have in terms of voting in this country.
Well, I did not expect to come on your show and talk about the mailbox rule and contract law, but there we are. You can't sue the government when they screw up for a reason, because, governments screw up all the time. And so I agree with you. I have a much more robust view of how the Constitution should protect voting rights than the courts do. What's at issue just to be clear, in the Wisconsin case, the argument was not that the deadline to request an absentee ballot needed to be extended. It was about the return of the ballots, where a voter, through no fault of their own, tries to vote, and because the mails don't, or either the election officials or the mails don't get the ballot to them in time, can't get it returned in time. It's just providing an additional cushion for the return of those ballots. There are going to be thousands of people across the country who are going to vote too late and who are going to be disenfranchised on that basis. And so some courts, especially given the pandemic, have said, we need to just allow for the fact that the mail's not working as well, whether that's intentional or not. I'm very sympathetic to what you're saying, but the Supreme Court has, developed these doctrines that are very anti-voter, and this is just one manifestation of that.
And when Kavanaugh says that this question of the federal court overruling the state court's ability to overrule or to interpret the state legislature, that's going to have broad implications that even goes beyond voting if that's adopted by the court, right?
It could have huge implications in a whole bunch of cases. There's a very good op-ed on this in this morning's New York Times by Akhil Amar, Vik Amar, and Neil Kachel, making this point that there are lots of times that state courts rely on state constitutions to say that a state law is unconstitutional and needs to be changed, and that it doesn't just apply in the context of presidential elections. This is about congressional elections too. And it would take us down this really tough path of trying to figure out what the power of state courts could be and the kind of state legislative supremacy. When you take into account also the gerrymandering that led to these state legislatures looking the way they are, really can solidify not only a minoritarian rule, but a rule that doesn't even respect the state's own greater protection for voting rights than the federal Constitution provides.
I mean, this could have implications because you've also you wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago, I guess it was, about the implications of Amy Coney Barrett getting on the court in terms of voting, broadly speaking. And one of the things that is at issue is there are some states via referendum or perhaps the legislature who are trying to establish commissions, independent commissions to deal with gerrymandering so that they could draw districts that are not giving us the outcome that we see in Wisconsin, where you have something like 54% of the people vote for a Democrat and Republicans control 64% of the seats in the Senate, which, it sounds bizarre, but that's what gerrymandering does. The idea here, if I understand it, if Kavanaugh's perspective holds here, then there is no way for a state to in any way delegate authority, a state legislature to delegate authority to even an independent commission that they vote for to create districts, right, that are independent. Because if a state court can't have the opportunity to do their job distinct from a legislature, then a legislature can't give up that power in any way anyways.
Well, I think it's a bit more complicated than that, in part because of a 2015 case that the Supreme Court decided where this very issue came up. It's a case called the Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission versus Arizona Legislature. In that case, voters by initiative established a nonpartisan commission. The state legislature objected. The Supreme Court, on a 5-4 vote, in an opinion by Justice Ginsburg, with the liberals on the court joined by Justice Kennedy, said, legislature in this context means the legislative process, which can include the initiative process in those states that have it. Chief Justice Roberts wrote one of his most vehement dissents in that case. And what he said, and this is where maybe he differs from Kavanaugh somewhat, he said, legislature in this context means legislature, and you can't totally cut the legislature out of the process. The legislature has to have some role in the process. So Roberts provided maybe a little bit of wiggle room in this case. And it didn't get attention, but in this Wisconsin ruling that came out earlier this week, Roberts explained that the situation in state courts and federal courts might be different. State courts would have more authority. So it's really not clear where Roberts is on this question. And also remember, Roberts is someone who respects precedent. In a recent abortion case, he sided with a position that was the opposite of his own position in dissent, because this is in a Louisiana abortion case, because he doesn't think the Supreme Court's ruling should be so easily overturned. But now you have Barrett on the court, so it's possible that the conservatives will be able to act now without Roberts So it's really complicated because and there's a whole bunch of cases that say, for example, even though state legislature, these are older cases, a case called Smiley versus Holm is one of them, even though a state legislature has the power to set the rules for redistricting, it's through the normal legislative process, which includes a role for the governor. I mean, if you took this theory to its crazy logical conclusion, you'd say that state legislatures have a constitutional right to engage in redistricting without even the governor and without the states being able to have review. Even Kavanaugh suggested in his concurrence that maybe that goes too far, and that, in the context of what state courts do, they can't substantially deviate from what the legislature wants. So there's a lot of room for nuance here. We don't know exactly how it's going to go, but taking the idea to its logical conclusion, it would be this vast legislative supremacy, which would have huge implications across a raft of election kinds of issues.
Okay, and that second element of Kavanaugh's thing, the concept of flipping an election, I still, I mean, of all the events that have happened, I still remember exactly where I was on the night of the election in 2020. I mean, excuse me, the year 2000. And I remember quite well the sort of shock in the legal institution. It seemed to me that the Supreme Court wouldn't get involved themselves in that case at all. And the idea that we don't want to prejudice the country again, or we don't want to prejudice George W. Bush. The idea that he's won the election by allowing counting to continue, or some way, that flip seemed very consistent. The use of flip seemed very consistent with that idea. And Kavanaugh, of course, was involved in the legal team for Bush at that time. I don't know how extensively he was involved.